The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke, fire, and screams. Explosions lit up the sky, and the ground shook under the weight of marching soldiers. Amid the chaos, a lone figure moved slowly, his uniform torn and bloodied. He was a soldier, but not one who fought for glory or power. He fought because he had no choice. His name didn't matter. His past didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. As he stumbled through the wreckage, something caught his eye, a faint movement under a pile of rubble. He hesitated. Helping someone could cost him his life, but ignoring it would cost him his soul. With a groan, he pushed aside the debris and found her. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her clothes were simple, but there was a regal air about her, even in her battered state. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with strength. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made him freeze. He turned and saw a group of soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, their weapons drawn. They were searching for something, or someone. The woman's grip tightened on his arm. "Please," she said, her voice urgent. "Don't let them find me." The soldier didn't know who she was or why she was being hunted. But in that moment, he made a decision. He would protect her, no matter the cost. As he helped her to her feet and they disappeared into the smoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. The soldier moved quickly, pulling the woman through the maze of shattered buildings and burning vehicles. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from the physical exertion but from the weight of the decision he had made. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing: she was important. And that made her dangerous. The sound of boots crunching on debris grew louder behind them. The enemy soldiers were closing in. The woman stumbled, her strength fading, but the soldier tightened his grip on her arm. "Keep moving," he whispered, his voice firm but calm. "We can't stop now." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they ducked into a narrow alley, the shadows swallowing them whole. The soldier pressed his back against the wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He peeked around the corner and saw the enemy soldiers fanning out, their weapons raised. "They're searching every corner," he muttered. "We need a way out of here." The woman glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. Then she pointed to a small, half-collapsed building a few meters away. "There," she said. "There's a tunnel beneath it. It leads outside the city." The soldier raised an eyebrow. "How do you know that?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No time to explain. Trust me." He didn't have the luxury of arguing. With a nod, he helped her across the open space, their footsteps silent against the rubble. They slipped into the building, and the woman led him to a hidden hatch in the floor. She pulled it open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. "Go," she said, gesturing for him to enter. The soldier hesitated for a moment, then climbed down, his boots hitting the damp ground below. The woman followed, closing the hatch behind her. The tunnel was pitch black, but she seemed to know where she was going. She took his hand and guided him forward, her touch surprisingly steady. As they moved through the darkness, the soldier couldn't help but wonder who she was. She wasn't just a civilian caught in the crossfire, she was someone who knew secrets, someone who inspired fear in her enemies. But he didn't ask. Not yet. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged on the other side of the city, the battlefield now a distant roar behind them. The woman collapsed against a tree, her breathing heavy. The soldier knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of pursuit. "We're not safe yet," he said. "They'll keep looking for you." She nodded, her expression grim. "I know. But thank you, for saving me." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a resilience that spoke of someone who had endured far more than he could imagine. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice soft. She met his gaze, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Someone who owes you her life," she said. "And someone who might just change the course of this war." The soldier didn't know what to say to that. But as they set off into the wilderness, the weight of her words hung in the air, a promise, or perhaps a warning, of what was to come. The forest was thick and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. The soldier and the woman moved cautiously, their footsteps soft against the damp earth. The soldier kept his guard up, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. The woman, though visibly tired, walked with a quiet determination, as if she had done this many times before. After hours of walking, they reached a small, hidden village nestled in a clearing. The houses were simple, made of wood and stone, and the air was filled with the scent of cooking fires. The soldier hesitated at the edge of the village, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he no longer carried. "We'll be safe here," the woman said, her voice calm. "At least for a little while." The soldier nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. As they stepped into the village, the villagers stopped what they were doing and turned to look at them. At first, there was silence. Then, one by one, they began to bow. The soldier froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He turned to the woman, who stood tall and composed, her chin lifted slightly. She acknowledged the villagers with a small nod, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" the soldier asked, his voice low. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to an elderly man who had stepped forward from the crowd. He bowed deeply, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Your Highness," he said. "We thought we'd lost you." The soldier's breath caught in his throat. "Your Highness?" He stared at the woman, his mind racing. She was royalty. But how? And why had she been on the battlefield? The woman, no, the queen, turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner," she said. "But my identity is a secret, even to those who fight for me. If the enemy had discovered who I was..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The soldier understood. If the enemy had captured her, the war would have been over before it even began. The villagers quickly ushered them into one of the larger houses, where they were given food and water. The soldier sat in silence, his mind reeling. He had saved a queen. A queen who was now depending on him to keep her safe. As they ate, the queen explained her story. Her kingdom had been overthrown by a ruthless warlord, and she had been forced into hiding. The battle they had escaped from was part of a larger conflict, a fight to reclaim her throne and bring peace to the land. "I've been traveling in secret, gathering allies and resources," she said. "But the enemy is always one step ahead. They know I'm the key to ending this war, and they'll stop at nothing to capture me." The soldier listened intently, his respect for her growing with every word. She wasn't just a queen, she was a leader, someone who was willing to risk everything for her people. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly, her eyes locking onto his. "You didn't know who I was. You could have left me there." The soldier thought for a moment, then shrugged. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "You're a good man," she said. "And I'm grateful to have you by my side." As night fell, the soldier found himself standing outside, staring up at the stars. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had gone from being a nameless soldier to the protector of a queen. And though the road ahead was dangerous, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't abandon her. The village was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The soldier sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the weight of the queen's revelation settled over him. She was royalty, a symbol of hope for her people, and now his life was tied to hers in ways he couldn't fully understand. But as the night deepened, doubts began to creep into his mind. He had no stake in this war, no loyalty to her cause. He was just a soldier, a man who had been thrown into a conflict he didn't choose. And now, he was risking his life for someone he barely knew. The next morning, the soldier wandered through the village, his thoughts heavy. He noticed a group of villagers whispering among themselves, their eyes darting in his direction. He approached them, and they fell silent, their expressions uneasy. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firm. One of the villagers, a young man with a nervous look, stepped forward. "There's a bounty," he said hesitantly. "A large one. For her." The soldier's heart sank. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it real. The enemy was offering a reward for the queen's capture, enough to change a man's life forever. The villager handed him a crumpled piece of paper. It was a wanted poster, with a rough sketch of the queen's face and a sum of money that made the soldier's head spin. "They're saying anyone who helps her will be punished," the villager added, his voice trembling. We can't protect her anymore." The soldier clenched his fists, his mind racing. He could turn her in, claim the reward, and walk away from this war forever. He could start a new life, far away from the bloodshed and chaos. But then he thought of her, her strength, her determination, the way she had looked at him when she called him a good man. He thought of the villagers who had bowed to her, their faces filled with hope. And he thought of his own past, the choices he had made that had led him here. He couldn't do it. He couldn't betray her. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it gnawed at him as the day wore on. That evening, as they prepared to leave the village, the queen noticed his silence. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle. The soldier hesitated, then handed her the wanted poster. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I understand if you want to leave," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "This isn't your fight. You've already done more than anyone could ask." The soldier looked at her, his heart torn. "I made a promise," he said quietly. "And I don't break my promises." She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "But know this, if the time comes when you need to walk away, I won't hold it against you." As they set off into the wilderness once more, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The enemy was closing in, and the bounty on her head would bring out the worst in people. Trust was a fragile thing, and he wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. The forest stretched endlessly before them, a sea of green and shadows. The soldier and the queen moved steadily, their pace quick but cautious. The bounty on her head had changed everything. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, made the soldier tense. He knew they were being hunted, and not just by the enemy soldiers. Greed could turn even the most ordinary person into a threat. The queen, however, seemed unshaken. She walked with purpose, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "There's a city to the east," she said, breaking the silence. "If we can reach it, we'll find allies who can help us." The soldier nodded, though he wasn't sure what to expect. Cities were dangerous places, full of spies and informants. But he trusted her judgment. She had survived this long, after all. As they traveled, the queen began to open up more. She spoke of her kingdom, a land of rolling hills and bustling markets, now reduced to ash and ruin. She spoke of her people, their resilience, and their hope for a better future. And she spoke of her vision, a world where no one had to live in fear. The soldier listened, his respect for her growing with every word. She wasn't just fighting for her throne, she was fighting for something much bigger. But the journey was far from easy. They faced challenges at every turn, raging rivers, treacherous cliffs, and wild animals. At one point, they were caught in a sudden storm, the rain pouring down in sheets. They took shelter under a rocky overhang, shivering and soaked to the bone. The queen laughed, a sound that surprised the soldier. "I've faced armies and assassins," she said, "but this might be the worst yet." The soldier couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, she hadn't lost her spirit. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. They shared stories of their pasts, their dreams, and their fears. The soldier told her about his life before the war, a simple existence that now felt like a distant memory. She listened intently, her eyes filled with empathy. "You've given up so much," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Why?" The soldier thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Not everyone would see it that way," she said. The soldier knew she was right. The world was full of people who would have turned her in without a second thought. But he wasn't one of them. One night, as they camped under the stars, the queen turned to him, her expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I've been keeping from you." The soldier's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "The city we're heading to, it's not just a safe haven. It's the last stronghold of my loyalists. If we can reach it, we can rally an army and take back my kingdom. But the enemy knows this too. They'll do everything in their power to stop us." The soldier nodded, his mind racing. He had known the stakes were high, but this was more than he had bargained for. "If you want to turn back," she said, her voice soft, "I'll understand." The soldier looked at her, his resolve hardening. "I'm not turning back," he said. "We've come too far to give up now." She smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. As they continued their journey, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm. But he also knew one thing: he would stand by her side, no matter what. The city loomed in the distance, its towering walls and spires a stark contrast to the wilderness they had traveled through. The soldier and the queen stood on a hill, surveying their destination. It was a place of hope, but also of danger. "We're close," the queen said, her voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. "But this is where it gets difficult." The soldier nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword. He knew the enemy would be watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. They had to be careful. As they approached the city gates, they were met by a group of guards. The queen stepped forward, her head held high. "I am your queen," she declared, her voice firm and commanding. "I have returned to reclaim my throne." The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a grizzled man with a scar across his face, stepped forward. "Your Highness," he said, bowing slightly. "We've been expecting you. But you must come quickly. The enemy is near." The soldier's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but the queen nodded and followed the guards into the city. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an uneasy silence. They were led to a large building in the center of the city, where a group of loyalists awaited them. The queen was greeted with cheers and bows, but the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the queen addressed her loyalists, the soldier kept his eyes on the guards. He noticed one of them slipping away, his movements furtive. Without a word, the soldier followed him. The guard led him to a dark alley, where a group of armed men waited. The soldier's heart sank as he realized the truth: they had walked into a trap. He turned to run, but it was too late. The armed men surrounded him, their weapons drawn. The soldier fought valiantly, but he was outnumbered. A blow to the head sent him crashing to the ground, his vision blurring. When he came to, he was in a dimly lit cell, his hands bound. The queen was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through him as he realized what had happened. The enemy had infiltrated the city, and they had captured her. The door to the cell creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and imposing, with a cold, calculating gaze. The soldier recognized him immediately. He was the enemy's commander, the man who had overthrown the Queen's kingdom. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble," the commander said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But it's over now. The Queen is ours, and there's nothing you can do to save her." The soldier glared at him, his mind racing. He had failed her. He had promised to protect her, and now she was in the hands of her enemies. But as the commander turned to leave, the soldier noticed something, a small, hidden knife in the corner of the cell. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had. As the door slammed shut, the soldier began to work on his bindings, his determination burning brighter than ever. He had come too far to give up now. He would find a way to save her, no matter the cost. The cell was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and despair. The soldier worked tirelessly, his fingers fumbling with the hidden knife he had spotted. The bindings around his wrists were tight, but he refused to give up. Every second counted. Finally, the ropes gave way. He rubbed his raw wrists and stood, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. He had to find the Queen. He had to make things right. The cell door was heavy and locked, but the soldier wasn't deterred. He searched the small space for anything he could use as a tool. In the corner, he found a rusted nail. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He jammed it into the lock, twisting and turning until he heard a satisfying click. The door creaked open, and the soldier peered into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He moved quickly and quietly, his senses on high alert. As he navigated the labyrinth of corridors, he overheard two guards talking. "The Queen's trial is tomorrow," one of them said. "The commander wants it to be public, a message to anyone who still supports her." The soldier's heart raced. He didn't have much time. He waited until the guards passed, then slipped into the shadows. He needed a plan, and he needed allies. The Queen had mentioned loyalists in the city. If he could find them, they might stand a chance. The soldier made his way to the lower levels of the city, where the poor and disenfranchised lived. It was a place of narrow alleys and crowded streets, perfect for disappearing. He approached a group of men huddled around a fire, their faces grim. "I'm looking for those who still believe in the Queen," he said, his voice low but firm. The men exchanged wary glances. One of them, a burly man with a scarred face, stepped forward. "Who's asking?" "A friend," the soldier replied. "Someone who wants to see her freed." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." He led the soldier to a hidden basement, where a group of rebels was gathered. They were a mix of farmers, merchants, and former soldiers, ordinary people who had been pushed too far. The soldier explained the situation, his voice filled with urgency. "The Queen is set to be executed tomorrow. If we don't act now, we'll lose her forever." The rebels listened intently, their faces hardening with resolve. "We've been waiting for a chance to strike," the scarred man said. "But we need a plan." The soldier nodded. "Here's what we'll do." The next morning, the city square was packed with people. The enemy commander stood on a raised platform, the Queen beside him, her hands bound and her face bruised but defiant. "This woman," the commander declared, "is a traitor to the people. Today, she will face justice." The crowd murmured uneasily, but no one dared to speak out. Just as the commander raised his hand to signal the execution, chaos erupted. The soldier and the rebels stormed the square, their weapons drawn. The crowd scattered as the two sides clashed, the air filled with the sounds of steel and shouts. The soldier fought his way to the platform, his eyes locked on the Queen. He reached her just as the commander turned to face him. "You're too late," the commander sneered, drawing his sword. The soldier didn't respond. He charged, his blade clashing with the commander's. The fight was fierce, each man driven by desperation and determination. But the soldier had something the commander didn't, a cause worth fighting for. With a final, powerful strike, he disarmed the commander and knocked him to the ground. The queen watched, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. The soldier cut her bonds and helped her to her feet. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. But the queen shook her head. "No," she said. "This is where we make our stand." She turned to the crowd, her voice ringing out. "People of this city. You have been oppressed for too long. But today, we fight back. Today, we reclaim our freedom." The crowd erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by hope. The rebels rallied around the queen, their spirits lifted by her words. The soldier stood by her side, his heart swelling with pride. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something the enemy didn't: unity. The city square had become a battlefield. The rebels, fueled by the queen's words, fought with a ferocity that surprised even the enemy. The soldier stood at the forefront, his sword flashing as he defended the queen and rallied their makeshift army. The enemy commander, though wounded, was not defeated. He barked orders to his soldiers, trying to regain control of the chaos. "Kill them all," he roared. "Leave no one standing." But the tide was turning. The people of the city, inspired by the queen's courage, began to join the fight. Men and women armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, knives, even stones, charged into the fray. The enemy soldiers, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, began to falter. The queen fought alongside her people, her presence a beacon of hope. She moved with grace and determination, her every action a testament to her strength. The soldier stayed close to her, his sword cutting down anyone who dared to threaten her. As the battle raged on, the soldier spotted the enemy commander trying to retreat. "He's getting away," he shouted to the queen. She nodded, her eyes blazing with resolve. "We can't let him escape. He's the heart of this war." Together, they fought their way through the chaos, their focus solely on the commander. He was heading for the city gates, where a group of his loyal soldiers waited with horses. The soldier and the queen reached him just as he mounted his horse. The commander sneered down at them, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This isn't over. I'll return with an army, and I'll crush you all." The queen stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "You've lost," she said. "Your people have turned against you. Your reign of terror ends here." The commander laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're a fool if you think this changes anything." Before he could spur his horse into a gallop, the soldier lunged forward, grabbing the reins and pulling the commander from his saddle. The two men tumbled to the ground, grappling for control. The fight was brutal, each man driven by desperation. The commander was strong, but the soldier had something he didn't: a reason to fight. With a final, powerful blow, the soldier knocked the commander unconscious. The queen approached, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "It's over," she said softly. The soldier nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over." With their leader defeated, the enemy soldiers began to surrender. The rebels cheered, their voices rising in triumph. The city, once a place of fear and oppression, was now filled with hope. But the queen knew their work was far from done. She turned to the soldier, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." The soldier shook his head. "This was your victory," he said. "You inspired them. You gave them hope." She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Hope is a powerful thing," she said. "But it's fragile. We must protect it." As the sun set over the city, the queen and the soldier stood together, surveying the aftermath of the battle. The road ahead would be difficult, but they had taken the first step toward a better future. The city was alive with celebration. The streets, once filled with fear and silence, now echoed with laughter and music. The people had reclaimed their home, and the queen stood at the center of it all, her presence a symbol of hope and renewal. The soldier watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. He had played a part in this victory, but he knew it was her strength and leadership that had truly inspired the people. As the celebrations continued, the queen approached him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done so much for me," she said. "For all of us. I can never repay you." The soldier shook his head. "You don't need to repay me," he said. "Seeing this city come alive again is reward enough." She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "What will you do now?" she asked. The soldier hesitated. He had been so focused on the fight that he hadn't thought about what came next. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so long fighting that I'm not sure what peace looks like." The queen nodded, her gaze distant. "Peace is fragile," she said. "It requires constant care and effort. But it's worth it." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "Stay," she said. "Help me rebuild. Together, we can create something truly extraordinary." The soldier looked at her, his heart torn. He had grown to care for her, not just as a queen but as a person. But he also knew that his place was not in the halls of power. "I'm just a soldier," he said quietly. "I don't belong in a palace." The queen reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're more than a soldier," she said. "You're a hero. And heroes belong wherever they choose to be." The soldier smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you," he said. "But I think my journey is leading me elsewhere." The queen nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Wherever you go," she said, "know that you will always have a home here." The soldier bowed his head, his heart heavy but at peace. "Thank you, Your Highness." As the days passed, the soldier prepared to leave. The queen, true to her word, ensured he had everything he needed for his journey. On the morning of his departure, she met him at the city gates. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And remember, you've made a difference. Not just for me, but for an entire kingdom." The soldier nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'll never forget," he said. With a final nod, he turned and walked away, the rising sun casting a golden light on the path ahead. He didn't know where his journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain: he had played a part in something greater than himself. Epilogue. Years later, the soldier's story became legend. The queen, now a beloved ruler, often spoke of the brave man who had saved her life and helped her reclaim her kingdom. His name was never forgotten, a symbol of courage and selflessness. And though the soldier never returned to the city, he carried the lessons he had learned with him. He had seen the power of hope, the strength of unity, and the importance of fighting for what was right. In the end, his legacy was not just in the battles he had fought, but in the lives he had touched. And that, he knew, was the greatest victory of all.